Well, good evening. Today rather tonight, we're in Psalm chapter 55, and most scholars call these kind of prayers imprecatory. That is, David wants God to deal with the enemy, and most oftentimes very severely. If you look in verse number 9, David says, "Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues." In verse number 15, "Let death cease upon them, and let them go down into hell. For wickedness is in their dwellings and among them." Now, it might seem somewhat strange to pray this kind of prayer because it just seems unchristian like. But I just want to suggest and encourage, really, that we pray against the evil that's going on in the world and not just overlook it and be silent. That we take this prayer, imprecatory prayer to God, and ask God to deal with the evil that's among us. And I don't know if you've ever prayed like that, but you see it all the time through the Psalms. But now let's look at the problem, and the problem is very severe because David will talk about how his own friends, those people who are close to you or people that you loved, turned against you. And David will, of course, speak about this in such a deep anguish way. If you look down here in verse 55 and begin to look just for a moment, because I want you to see the trouble and just bewildered by it, that people that you know and people that you care about, those people who are really close to you, you don't anticipate that they would turn against you and that they would hate you and that they want to destroy you. David will say, if it was somebody on the outside, that is not somebody in your own circle, if it wasn't the brethren, if it wasn't people that you hold very dear, he could handle that. Notice here, he'll say in verse number 12, "For if it was not an enemy that reproached me, I could have borne it," he says. "Neither was I hated me that did magnify against me, then I would have hid myself from him." If it was an enemy that was a stranger to you, or an enemy that you knew about that wasn't in your own family, but he says the problem is in verse 13, "It was thou, a man my equal, a guide, and my own acquaintance." See, that's hard to deal with, isn't it? And yet he'll say, "And they took sweet counsel." Think about friends that who were your close friends, your former friends, and they turn against you, and they actually walked in the house of God with you. That's why I said sometimes it can be even those whom you worship with, who are in your own assembly, and they turn against you, and that's just really, really hurtful, and it's painful. So you can deal with the folks that are strangers and people that you're not close to, and even people who are constantly against you. But when it's in your own family, when it's in your own circle of friends, that becomes very painful. Now, I want you to see very briefly tonight 4 things that David does in this kind of circumstance, which I suggest that it's not always done like this. In the first place, David will pray. I mean, David prays about this. Notice in verse number 1, he says, "Give ear to my prayer." Now, I just want you to think about this. I don't know if you pray like this, but you're asking God to answer you. You want God to hear you. And so you pray about it in the first place. He says, give ear, O God, and hide not yourself from my supplication." Notice again in verse number 2, "Attend unto me and hear me, I groan and mourn." So the first thing that I want to suggest to you when you're facing trouble in your own circle, when it's so devastating, that you turn to God in prayer. Notice in verse number 22, "Cast your burden upon the Lord. All right, now that seems like a simple thing to do, but many times it's about the last thing we do. Now notice number 2. The second thing I want you to think about when you're going through something that is very painful. Notice he'll say the following in verse number 2. I mourned with my complaint. Now, I mentioned to you that complaining generally isn't a good thing. When people generally murmur and complain, it's usually in a negative sense, and it hardly ever does any good. But I want you to think about this. You can bring your complaint to God, and so God will listen to your complaint. You know, most people don't. Most people don't want to hear your complaining. They don't want to hear your belly aching, and they won't even listen to it. So he's bringing his complaint before God here in the second place. And then thirdly, I want you to look at this from the sense of, what do I got, number 3? Oh, number 3, and I've been saying it a lot of times, is that you can really pour out your feelings towards God. Now, I don't know. I think that sometimes we want to, be on the high ground, and our prayers sound very eloquent and very pious, and especially we do this in public prayer. You have to remember that these prayers, these hymns, these songs that David is writing also found themselves in the corporate worship service. But I want you to think about pouring out your heart to God. Have you ever prayed to God, God, I'm losing my mind, I'm broken, I'm hurt, I'm angry, I feel destroyed. He said, notice, I'll just read these verses and you can see it. And I want you to think about, I'm really trying to get you to think about pouring out your heart on the throne of God. Notice number 4. My heart is sore pained. In other words, God, I'm in deep distress. Anguish is overwhelming me. And he'll go on to say, within me. See, I want you to say about what's within you, and not just what sounds good, what not sounds real religious, but he's saying, my heart, God, is pained within me, and the terrors of death, he says, are falling upon me. God, I'm afraid. I'm so afraid, he'll say, that my body trembles. I'm shaken. And so you can see the great fear that David has. And I'm going to spend some time later about how faith and fear can collaborate one another. But I just want you to see David is praying to God because the enemies are against him and bringing great stress to him. And David pours out his heart to God. And I want you to do that. So make your prayers real. Notice again, fearfulness and trembling are come upon me. See how sincere that is. See how honest that is. God, I'm trembling. I shudder. This is so devastating that my friends would turn against me, that my own family hates me. And it's just tearing me apart. And so he says, it has overwhelmed me. Think of that. Think about praying like that. God, I'm in such a pit. I feel so alone. I feel so everybody's against me that I just tremble over it. Verse 6. Oh, I said, if I had wings, I think about this. If I had wings like a dove, man, I'd get out of here. I'd run. If I could just fly away and vanish, I'd do that, Lord. I'd just get out of here as fast as I could. There's notice that's what we want to do sometimes, don't we? But I want you to keep in mind as I'm saying this, that he's pouring out his heart to God in prayer. Notice again, lo, I would wander off and remain in the wilderness. Oh, just for that simple life. And then number 8, I would hasten from a windy storm and a tempest. Boy, if the trouble, I'd run from trouble just as fast as I could. So what I'm suggesting to you in the third place here is that David is pouring out his heart before God. And I want you to do that. I mean, if you feel alone and you think that God has forsaken you and you don't understand why and you're bewildered, and I want you to just pour out your heart to God. God knows that. And so you're telling God just how you really feel. And it may be disappointment, and it may be anger, and you might even say, Lord, this is just I just don't understand why you haven't done something. And I want you to be honest in your prayer, and make it a fervent prayer that's real. Now, number four, what David does, and this is going to sound a little bit strange to you maybe, but in all of this, David declares his faith in God. Now, what I mean by that, it's easy, isn't it, to declare your faith. If someone asks you, was God faithful? Can you trust him? In good times, you can answer that almost flippantly. You can say, sure, God is faithful. You can trust him. But what about when you're in trouble? Can you trust him? You can say the same thing about love. You can talk to people in a nice little sermon, or just in a nice little group study, and talk about the love of God, and surely God does love us. Well, what about when things are not going well? You can talk about God forgives, but what happens if you really messed up? Do you really think God forgives you? What I'm suggesting to you, it's easy when it's, things are going well and you're not in trouble to believe a lot of things. But what happens when the floor collapses under you and the ceiling caves on you and you're seeing trouble all around you? It's pretty hard then, isn't it? And what David does, I want you to see this in a number of places here. If you look down in verse, verse 18 and 19, notice what I'm trying to say. Prayer gives you opportunity when you're talking to God in prayer to express your faith in him. And again, not in smooth times, but in troubled times. Notice verse 18. He has delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me. That's a declaration of faith, isn't it? And verse 19, God shall hear. In other words, God is going, that's a statement of faith. Hold on a minute. You're praying to God, you've asked him to help, and then you have a declaration of faith, and you say, God, I know you'll hear. I know you'll hear me. I know you'll answer my prayer. You see the faith there? And I mean, again, I want to just stress this. It's faith when you're stressed. Notice verse 23. This is the latter part. I will trust in thee. And so I'm saying in the fourth place that you make declarations, or as you're speaking to God in prayer, you're saying, God, I trust you. I know that you'll answer me. And that's just what you want to do in those kind of prayers. Wouldn't it be something? You go to somebody, you're in trouble, and you have complete trust in him that he'll handle that. That's the idea, casting your prayers upon him, isn't it? I mean, you're giving that burden to God, or if we were taking it from a human perspective, you're giving the problem to somebody else to fix, and you can walk away and trust them. You cast your burdens upon them, and you can rest and leave it there and don't take them back. Now let's read through it real quickly tonight, the verses at least I didn't cover, and let me go down to verse number 3, because, well, let's go ahead and just read through it. Hear my prayer, O God, and hide not thyself from my supplication. Don't be distant. Attend to me and hear me. I'm mourning, I'm groaning. It's almost like you can't even express your words in prayer about my complaint, and make a noise. And so you see, whatever the distress was, it's just agonizing, and he's voicing it out loud. Sometimes when you talk to people, you can see the mourning that they're going through, and how they can hardly speak a word. In verse number 3, because of the voice of my enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. These people are violent. They want to hurt you. And again, the problem is those people that want to hurt you is the people you love sometimes. For they cast iniquity upon me, and in their wrath they hate me. See, do you see that? Oh, that's a terrible thing, isn't it? Now, my heart is sore pained within me, and oh, can I just say it one more time, expressing your feelings to God. Notice here, and the terrors of death are upon me. Lord, I just feel like I'm going to die, and I'm fearful. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get out of this. It's just an awful, awful thing. And then it goes on to say in verse 6, oh, that I had wings wings. Sometimes you wish you had them, don't you? For then I would fly away. I'd be at rest. I'd just vanish. I'd just get away from it all. I'd just run as fast as I can. Then verse numbers, I would wander off and remain in the wilderness. I just get away from it all. Do you ever feel like that? I do sometimes. Now, I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and the tempest. Okay. Now, again, this imprecatory prayer, and there's a couple verses that we've already mentioned. Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues. That's what God did in Genesis 11. When He dispersed the people, at the Tower of Babel, and that's what He's praying for God to do to His enemy, confuse them and divide them and destroy them. Verse number 10, day and night they go out, you see, upon the walls, and mischief and sorrow. I mean, I don't want to get preaching on this, but you ever know people cause trouble, they don't keep it to themselves. All of a sudden you got a bunch of trouble. It's causing distress in the street. Sometimes it's in the church, in the whole assembly. Some people start their complaining and bickering, and then all of a sudden you got yourself a real mess. Now, wickedness is in the midst of there, and the guile and all of that terrible things that are going on. They're deceitful, they're wicked, there's guile, there's deceit. In fact, he'll say, their words are like butter. They're just smooth, they're slippery as an eel. And then in verse number 13, and I'm going through it quickly just for the sake that we can get through tonight, but it was thou a man mine equal. And again, I mentioned it's coming from within. That's where it's so very hurtful, when it's within the people that you know and people that you love and people you've been with. It's a horrible thing, a terrible thing, that when people that are so intimately close with you turn against you. It's just a sore thing, isn't it? Then in they took counsel together in the next verse, number 14, and those that even came into the house of God with company. When your own brethren turn against you, it's just an awful thing. Now, so again, the imprecatory prayer in verse number 15, that God is saying, let death cease upon them. And then verse number 16, I will call upon God. There again is that prayer, calling upon God to help. And then number 17, evening and morning. You see, it wasn't prayer sometimes we just pray and let it go, but he was consistent, and he prayed constantly, that he cried aloud. And the idea is praying aloud or crying aloud, it may be just a way of saying, God, I want you to hear you. When you cry aloud, you get God's attention. Then, of course, the statement of faith, verse 18 to 19, which we have read. And again, let me just say, I think it's significant and important that you say to God in your prayer, I believe in you, God. I trust you, God. I know you'll answer me. And so you're saying to God, when you're going through that, you're trusting him. And boy, if you trust God, okay. Now, again, when we get down to verse 23, again, casting your prayers upon him. Interesting background. We won't deal with it tonight, but Peter was a fisherman, wasn't he? And he would cast his nets upon the sea. I didn't use rods and reels like we do today. He wasn't a fly fisherman, but they would cast their nets, that is, throw them. The word cast, that a Greek word, exbalo, that means to throw out. And so you're giving these things to God to help you and to fix those things. And so, but thou, O God, thou shalt bring them down into the pit of destruction. See how that ends? So that ends in another imprecatory note. Bloody and deceitful men shall not live out their lives in their days. That just goes back to verse 15. Let death come upon them. Let death cease them. But I will trust in you. Now, you read this psalm a little bit slower and think about those 4 points that I made tonight. That take this trouble to God in prayer. And, bring the complaint to him, bring a complaint to God, not others, but to God, and do it in the right spirit with reverence. And number 3, I see it all through the Psalms as I'm reading it, that you can pour out your heart to God and what you're really feeling inside. And then in prayer, in the 4th part, you're making a statement or a declaration of faith in God. when you're in trouble. So those are the 4 points tonight. I hope they're helpful to you. I think that it makes prayer a really important and significant thing in our life. And we can learn really how to pray in the Psalms. And so I hope those were helpful to you. And we'll be looking at Psalm, I believe it's going to be Psalm 57 tomorrow. Hope to see you at 12 noon. And if I don't see you tomorrow morning, you be at church on Sunday. All right. So that's the lesson tonight, and we'll be seeing you tomorrow.